The Most Precious by John D. Keefauver. I have escaped. It is true. I am alive, if the condition I am in can be called living. My mouth still bleeds, and I am so weak. Dried blood covers my chin. Is splattered down the front of my suit. I cannot speak. No matter, I am alive. I know the secret. Worth millions if I can get back to the States. I have broken from the cords with which Abu Shalbak, the Syrian, bound me. I can find a doctor here in Damascus, and, unlike the girl, silent one, I can write. She can neither write nor speak. Perhaps never again able to speak. I must write it down, the secret. I must hurry. Silent One, her father, Abu Shalbak, called her. Little did I know the reason for such a name that first evening I saw her. The wildest imagination would not have guessed it. Certainly not mine. I saw her first as she stood beside her father's sidewalk toothpaste stand on Al-Malek Faisal Street, near Al-Chowda Square in the Syrian capital. A young dentist just out of school in Baltimore, taking a much-needed vacation through the Middle East before plunging into practice. I was attracted and amused by Abu Shalbak and his toothpaste selling stand. I had stumbled across his sidewalk business while returning to my hotel on Al-Chowda Square from a late afternoon stroll through the nearby bazaar. The man, dressed in what appeared to be a dirty nightgown, a rainbow-coloured towel around his head, was selling the paste by simply rubbing it over an aide's teeth with one rag, then polishing the incisors with another. During the whole process, Abu Shalbak kept up an almost unceasing flow of sales chatter, disrupting the polishing and spiel only long enough to sell an occasional tube of paste from a row of it on top of his stand. At intervals he would also take something from the boy's mouth. I couldn't make out what it was, and put it in a small jar on the stand. Aside from the comic aspects of the situation, what amazed me was that the aide, a boy, had the most brilliantly white teeth I, as a dentist, had ever seen. They shone like the Taj Mahal in moonlight. If I could make my future patient's teeth shine like this boy's, I knew I'd soon be rich. I edged into the smiling, laughing, dirty-faced crowd around the stand in order to get a better look. That was when I saw Silent One for the first time. Silently aloof, she made her way through the crowd and took up a position next to her salesman father, although at the time I didn't know they were father and daughter, nor did I know her name or his. What attracted me about her from the very beginning was her height and carriage, the regal-like tilt of her chin, the strong, clean, sharp features of her face, her dignity, her silence. She was a fantastic contrast to the boisterous, grinning group. She wore a veil as part of her free-hanging Moslem dress. But whereas the faces of the most veiled women in Damascus were completely covered, her veil started below her eyes. Her eyes. I fell into them immediately. They were great acorn-coloured puddles of warmth. Large, luminous, soft lights. The sun was going down. It seemed to set her eyes on fire. I stared too long. She lowered her gaze, not rapidly, though, but slowly, with dignity. and listened as her father spoke a few words to her in quiet, rapid Arabic, his blunt, beer-stubbled chin jumping with the words. He handed her the small jar as he talked. While in the service, I had learned some Arabic at the Defense Language School in California. My ability to speak the language was one reason I was holidaying in the Middle East. But Abu Shalbak spoke too rapidly for me to understand. Wordless, dignified, the girl moved, glided out of the group, carrying the jar, and disappeared into the dusk and maze of the narrow, shop-jammed streets of the bazaar area. I almost followed her that first night. I went back to Abu Shalbak's stand the next morning, hoping to see Silent One again, but she was not there. I stayed at the stand a while, again admiring the aide's brilliant teeth. And again I was unable to see what it was that the man took from the boy's mouth and put in the jar on the stand. That evening, when I returned once more, I found the girl, veiled of course, beside her father's side. Our eyes joined as she listened to his words. As I think back, I realize that Abu Shalbak must have become conscious of our mutual stare. He looked up quickly at me with a strange, penetrating, unfriendly gaze, then went on talking to his daughter. He gave her the jar from his hand, apparently the same one, now covered and refilled with something from his aide's mouth, that he had given her the day before. I sensed, even then, that I should not try to speak to her in her father's presence. When Silent One moved out of the group, I followed her, conscious that Abu Shalbak was watching me. I kept her in sight for a short while, debating whether I should try to stop her. I suppose I was conscious of the danger then, but I pushed it away and tried to catch her without breaking into a run. She went into the bazaar, walking rapidly, merging into the swirling, moving throng, picking her way through the crowd and the narrow, dirty, shop-littered alleyways, as if they were her home. Unaccustomed to slithering through the throng, I fell behind, and finally lost her in the vicinity of Umayyad Mosque. A few minutes before she disappeared, she turned and looked at me, her expression, so far as I could make out in the dusk, set in a sort of haughty neutrality. She knew I had been following her all the time. Of course, I went back to Abu Shalbak's stand the next day at the same time. Both Silent One and I arrived together, she from one direction, I from another, almost as if she, as I, had planned the meeting. I soon realized, however, that she did not want to see me. As soon as those powerful eyes of hers fell on me from the top of her veil, she went quickly up to her father. He spoke a few rapid words to her, gave her the covered jar, and she left him, taking the same route as the day before. This time I did not lose her. I followed her through the maze of dirty streets and passageways, and caught up with her in a matter of minutes, brashly putting my hand on her shoulder. She was nearly as tall as I, and when she spun on me, sweeping me with her eyes, I quickly dropped my hand. Pointing back over the route we had just covered, she indicated that I was to return and let her go on alone. She said nothing, and kept the jar behind her, hidden. I told her in my creaky Arabic that I did not wish to return, that I would be most happy if she would accompany me to dinner. Although she still said not a word, I could tell by her expression that she was surprised that I could speak the language. She continued to point out my return route, however. Smiling, I repeated my wishes. A flicker of friendliness, of acquiescence brushed across her face, then abruptly disappeared, and she moved on, stopping at intervals to indicate, wordless, that I should not follow her. I smiled, told her I understood, and kept after her. Near the Umayyad Mosque, she began to walk extremely rapidly. I too increased my pace, and had little trouble keeping her in view. Although it was almost dark, the streets became less crowded, and her height and carriage easily stood out against others in the narrow passageways. Just outside a wall of Azem Palace, she stopped and glanced back in my direction. Surrounded by a group of people, I was fairly well hidden at that moment. She did not see me. I saw her quickly duck into a doorway opposite the place. When I reached the spot, I hesitated. Beyond the doorway I could see nothing. I could hear nothing. But foolishly I stepped inside the door. Of course, I did not know then that Abu Shalbak, watching me, was standing in approximately the same spot where I had stood as I watched Silent One enter the doorway. I should have realized that he would follow me from his stand. After all, he had seen me start after his daughter twice. Inside the doorway I stood still for a moment. At first I heard nothing except sounds from the street outside. Then, yes, I heard quiet footsteps ahead of me. Just a few. Then silence. Then again more footsteps, and, a second later, the sound of a door being unlocked and cautiously opened and closed. Again, silence. I could see nothing. I slowly moved forward, groping my way, keeping a hand on one wall of the passageway. The floor was earthen. By reaching up, I could touch the stone roof. I shivered. Warmth must never have penetrated the corridor. I rounded a corner slowly, and saw a sliver of light a few yards ahead of me. As I watched, someone, Silent One, blocked out the light for a moment from within a room. I increased my pace, cautiously, and went directly to the sliver of light which, I learned, came out from below a rag-shaded window in a lamp-lighted room. I looked under the shade into the room, and felt, first, an exhilarating joy, then second, cold horror at what I saw. Silent One stood in an earthen floor room, containing a few nondescript chairs, a small table, 2 raggedy beds. She had taken off her veil and was pouring the contents of the jar her father had given her into a great metal pot that reached almost to her hips and sat in the centre of the room. Out of the jar came a gleaming yellow liquid, not gold. The sight of the liquid left me trembling with exhilaration. There was not a dentist in the world who would not give a fortune for what was in that metal pot. Then, the pouring completed, Silent One turned from the pot, her veilless face towards the window outside of which I stood. She had a glass straw between her lips. One end was stuck in a bowl she carried in her free hand. She was eating. At the sight of her face, I felt a horror that froze my very marrow. I must have recoiled from the sight, actually stepped back, for I bumped into Abu Shalbak just before he clubbed me. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the cold floor of the room. My ankles and wrists were tightly bound. A knife and additional cord were on a chair. My lips were not taped, however, and when I saw Abu Shalbak kneel down beside me, saw what was in his hands, and felt Silent One prop my head up with a pillow, I realized why. "No, for God's sake," I mumbled, first in English, then my mind catching up with my terror, in Arabic. "Please." "God watches out for those who watch out for themselves," Abu Shalbak said in Arabic, or words to that effect. "You have been most unwise in coming here." He bent down over me and brushed his fingers across my lips, feeling their texture. "Who are you?" I asked. God knows why. The terrorized mind resorts to habit, to routine, I suppose. The man shrugged. "I am called Abu Shalbak. I am the keeper of the most precious." He nodded towards the metal pot filled with the yellow liquid, then towards the girl. "This is my daughter, Silent One. She also watches the most precious." He shrugged again, his great black brows rising and forming almost a straight, continuous line above his eyes. "She has failed me before also. She talked then. Hence, her lips are as you see them, as yours will be too, as others have become when they see the most precious, or when they see Silent One, unveiled." He put one knee on my chest and one on my forehead. Silent One sat on my feet and pushed my bound hands into my groin. Thank God her father blocked my view of her face. "But I can write it," I screamed. "I can write, even if the others can't. I don't have to be able to talk." "You Americans, you think education means everything." He shrugged once more. "You cannot talk when you are dead." With that, I felt the needle go into my lip. I lost consciousness. I do not know how long I was unconscious. Hours, I suppose. When I awoke, Silent One and her father had gone. I was the only one in the room, still lit by the lamp. I was still bound. My mouth was filled with blood. The front of my clothes was stained by it. Without thinking, impulsively, I tried to open my mouth to yell for help. I couldn't, of course, and the pain was horrible. I must have passed out again, from pain, from the shock of realizing what had happened to my mouth. When I awoke the second time, nothing had changed in the room. The only difference was that now the blood on my clothes had dried. I lay there for I don't know how long before, looking wildly about, I noticed that the knife, apparently forgotten, was still on the chair. With much pain, any movement sent spasms of agony shooting through my mouth. I inched myself over to the chair and managed to pick up the knife between both hands. Fortunately, my hands were tied in front of me, rather than behind. The knife was sharp too. By sitting up and holding the handle between my palms, I was able to saw the cord around my ankles. My feet free, I wedged the handle between the sides of my insteps and was able to cut the cord on my wrists. The whole operation must have taken me more than an hour. I had to stop often because of the pain and weakness. I think I fainted once for a short period, and only fear that Silent One or Abu Shalbak might return kept me going. Before I left the room, I found a cup and hastily dipped it into the pot containing the most precious. I would need physical evidence of the yellow liquid, otherwise no one would believe my story. Then, weakly stumbling a number of times, falling at least once, Trying to fix the location of the room in my mind, I made my way back through the bazaar to my hotel. I kept a handkerchief over my mouth, of course. Even in the old section of Damascus, the sight of my lips would have caused alarm, perhaps have brought the police. I didn't want the police. An investigation would perhaps ruin my chances of getting back to the States with my yellow evidence. I wanted only a doctor, and to write the secret down. I am in my hotel now. A doctor is on his way. I gaze into a mirror. I smile, even though it hurts terribly to do so. Even if terrible scars remain in my lips, I would go through the same thing again to discover the location of the most precious. Joy surges in me. I am king. After all these years of searching by dental scientists, by the cream of the dental world, I, just out of school, led on by a boy's brilliant teeth, and ironically by a woman whose teeth were covered, whose lips had been sewn together, as mine are now, have discovered the greatest secret in the world of dentistry. I now know where the yellow went.